Welcome to our deep dive into the world of prediction. We'll be exploring excerpts from Tom Chivers' book, Everything is Predictable. And you might be surprised to learn just how much we rely on prediction, even for things we don't consciously think about. It turns out everything from bacteria to sophisticated AIs are in on the prediction game.
It really is woven into the fabric of existence, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
This deep dive is going to take you through how the surprisingly simple concept of Bayes' theorem has shaped so much, from major scientific advances to our own perception of the world around us.
I'm already intrigued. You know, when I hear Bayes' theorem, I immediately think, oh, math, complicated math.
Right.
But Chivers does a great job of making it accessible, even using a very relatable example about breast cancer testing.
Yeah, it's a fantastic example because it showcases how our intuition can sometimes lead us astray. Let's say there's a test for breast cancer that's 80% accurate for positive diagnoses and 90% accurate for negative ones. On the surface, that sounds pretty reliable, right?
Definitely. I mean, if a test is that accurate, you'd think the results would be pretty solid.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Imagine only 1% of women in a given population actually have breast cancer. Now, if a woman from this group gets a positive result, most people would assume there's a very high chance she has the disease.
Right, because we'd be focusing on that 80% accuracy rate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
However, we're missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, the initial probability. In this case, only 1% of women have the disease to begin with.
Right.
Chivers breaks down the math, and the actual probability of having breast cancer, given a positive test result in this scenario, plummets to just 7%.
Hold on, so you're saying there's only a 7% chance of actually having breast cancer, even though the test itself boasts an 80% accuracy rate? That seems almost backwards.
It highlights the power of Bayes' theorem. It's all about updating our beliefs with new evidence. It seems counterintuitive, but in this case, the low initial probability of having breast cancer dramatically outweighs the test's accuracy. The key takeaway is that relying solely on test accuracy could lead to misdiagnosing a whopping 9 out of 10 women.
That's eye-opening. It really underscores how important it is to look at the bigger picture, not just the immediate data point.
Right.
This feels like a pitfall that's easy to stumble into.
And stumble we have,
Yeah.
historically speaking.
Yeah.
Chivers takes us through how this misunderstanding of Bayes' theorem had a real impact during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly with the debate around immunity passports in the UK.
Oh, right. The idea was that if you tested positive for antibodies, you were good to go, right? Free to travel, mingle, that sort of thing.
Precisely. The assumption was that a positive antibody test meant immunity. But the tests, like most medical tests, weren't perfect. When you factor in the relatively low percentage of the population that had actually been infected at the time, many people were given a false sense of security based on the results.
So the passports were potentially putting people at risk because of this flawed interpretation of the data. Wow. It's amazing to see how this seemingly simple math concept can have such far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. And what's even more fascinating is that this same principle that tripped us up with COVID testing has a long and rich history.
Oh.
It all started with something as commonplace as tossing a coin or rolling a die.
So the seeds of this powerful idea were sown centuries ago with something as simple as a coin flip. Who were the early thinkers grappling with these ideas?
Mathematicians like Bernoulli and de Moivre were among the pioneers who started formalizing these concepts. They laid the groundwork for our understanding of probability, which, surprisingly enough, has become a cornerstone of modern artificial intelligence.
Now, that's a leap I didn't expect. From coin tosses to AI. How does Bayes' theorem, this idea of updating beliefs, apply to something as complex as AI?
At their core, even the most sophisticated AIs are essentially prediction machines.
Okay.
They devour massive amounts of data and then use that data to predict what's coming next. This could be the next word in a sentence, the next move in a chess game, even the next brush stroke in a painting.
Okay, that makes sense. So if I'm having a conversation with ChatGPT and it feels eerily human-like, is it essentially just predicting what a human would say based on all the text it's been trained on?
You got it. Think of it like an incredibly sophisticated autocomplete. But instead of just suggesting the next word, it's predicting whole conversations, weaving stories, even writing code.
That's fascinating and a little unsettling if you think about it too long. Are you saying these AIs are becoming master mimics? Is it just a sophisticated form of imitation?
That's a question that is stirring up a lot of discussion about creativity and originality. Chivers points out that AI image generators, like Daily 2, are essentially predicting what human artists would create based on a specific prompt.
Hmm.
They've analyzed millions of images and can now generate what appears to be original art, but it all boils down to prediction.
So then the question becomes, does the ability to predict equate to true understanding or genuine creation?
That's a question that's fueling some lively debate in philosophical circles, and it directly ties into a larger discussion of human rationality itself. Are we truly logical beings, or are we simply improvising as we go along, guided by intuition? Chivers delves into this fascinating question as well.
He does. I'm curious to see what he has to say about that. It seems like there's evidence pointing in both directions. On one hand, we have research highlighting all sorts of cognitive biases that trip us up. But on the other, we seem to navigate a pretty complex world reasonably well.
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Chivers contrasts the work of psychologists like Kahneman and Tversky, who demonstrated our susceptibility to cognitive biases and irrational tendencies, with researchers like Jens-Kud Madsen, who argues that we're actually quite rational in our day-to-day lives.
So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory viewpoints?
It seems that context is a key factor here. To illustrate this, Chivers uses the example of the Wasson selection task, a classic logic puzzle that involves cars with numbers and animals. Depending on how the task is framed, people's ability to solve it can change dramatically. When presented abstractly, most people struggle. But when the same logic is applied to a real-world scenario, they tend to do much better.
So you're saying that our brains might be more like specialized tools, really good at solving specific problems in our environment, but maybe not so great at abstract reasoning.
That's one way to look at it. Chivers highlights how our brains often employ heuristics, or mental shortcuts, to make quick and efficient decisions. These shortcuts help us avoid getting bogged down in complex calculations. Take the gaze heuristic, for instance. Cricket fielders and fighter pilots use it to effortlessly track a ball or target without needing to consciously calculate trajectories.
Wow.
They simply adjust their movements to keep the object in a constant position in their field of vision.
That's so cool. It's almost like our brains have evolved these elegant solutions that are both efficient and effective. It makes you wonder how much of what we perceive as intelligence is really just a collection of these clever tricks.
That's a fantastic question, and it leads us to an even more mind-blowing concept, the idea that our very perception of reality is shaped by prediction.
Wait a minute, are you saying that what we see, hear, and feel isn't an accurate representation of the world, but rather a prediction based on what our brain expects?
You're on the right track.
That's wild.
Chivers draws on the work of neuroscientist Anil Seth, who describes the brain as a prediction machine. According to this view, our brains are constantly trying to infer the causes of sensory information.
Okay.
And how do they do this? By making predictions and then comparing them to the actual signals coming in from our senses.
So it's like our brains are constantly building this model of the world and using it to filter and interpret everything we experience. But what happens when those predictions are wrong?
That's when we get those aha moments, those surprises that
Whoa.
force us to update our model. To illustrate this, Chivers uses the optical illusion of the disappearing finger in the blind spot.
Okay.
Our brain fills in the missing information based on what it expects to see. But when we realize there's a discrepancy, it grabs our attention.
Thinking about it now, I can see how that applies to real-life situations as well. There have been so many times I've misinterpreted a situation or jumped to the wrong conclusion. Was my brain just trying to make sense of things based on its limited model of the world?
It's definitely a possibility. And this brings us to a really intriguing question. How can this Bayesian framework, this idea of prediction and updating beliefs, help us understand those bigger, more philosophical questions?
Okay, I'm hooked.
Yeah.
You mentioned philosophical questions. How can something as seemingly practical as Bayes' theorem be applied to those big abstract ideas?
Chivers explores how this framework can provide a fresh perspective on some age-old philosophical puzzles. Take the definition of a game, for example, or the classic paradox of the heap. He suggests that by thinking in terms of probabilities and degrees of belief, we can move beyond rigid categories and avoid the trap of all-or-nothing thinking.
So instead of asking, is this a game or not, we can ask, what's the probability that this fits our definition of a game?
Right.
That's a really interesting way to approach it.
Exactly. It allows for a lot more nuance and flexibility in our thinking. And Chivers even touches on how this Bayesian perspective might help us understand complex mental states, like depression.
You mean there's a connection between depression and Bayes' theorem? How does that work?
It's a relatively new area of research. But some scientists believe that depression might be related to overly strong, inflexible prior beliefs. It's like getting stuck in a negative thought pattern and being unable to update those beliefs, even when presented with evidence to the contrary.
So, if someone has a strong prior belief that they're a failure, for example, they might interpret everything that happens through that lens, even their successes.
Hmm.
It's like their brain is predicting negative outcomes and it filters out any information that contradicts those predictions.
That's the idea.
It
It's
is.
like their brain is predicting negative outcomes, and it filters out any information that contradicts those predictions. Chivers highlights the work of Robin Carhart Harris, who is exploring how psychedelic drugs like psilocybin might help loosen the grip of those rigid priors, allowing for new perspectives and experiences to filter in.
Psychedelic drugs to treat depression. That's a pretty radical idea, but also kind of fascinating. Are you saying that these substances might be able to shake up our belief systems and help us break free from negative thought patterns?
It's still early in the research, but the findings are promising. It speaks to the power of challenging our assumptions and being open to new information. But that's a conversation for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll look into the implications of this Bayesian framework for even bigger questions.
I can't wait. This is really making me question everything I thought I knew about how my brain works. It's mind-blowing to think that our perceptions and even our mental states might be shaped by these predictions. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into this rabbit hole of prediction. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of prediction.
I'm excited to pick up where we left off. We were just starting to explore the mind-bending concept that our very sense of self, our subjective experience, might be rooted in our brain's incredible ability to predict.
Yeah, it's a fascinating and kind of unsettling idea. If our brains are essentially prediction machines, always working to minimize errors, does that mean we have less control over our thoughts and actions than we think?
That's a profound question, and one that gets to the heart of the free will debate.
Right.
One way to explore this is to look at how prediction plays a role in even the most fundamental processes of life.
Evolution.
Evolution.
Um,
I'm not sure I follow the connection there. You mean survival of the fittest and all that? How does
yeah.
that tie back to Bayes' theorem and this idea of prediction? It might seem like a stretch at first, but consider evolution as a process of trial and error. It's a way of searching for solutions that work within a given environment.
Okay.
Organisms with traits that give them a survival advantage, traits that allow them to reproduce more successfully, pass those traits on to the next generation. And this can be seen as a form of prediction, where the prior is the existing genetic makeup of a population, and the likelihood is determined by how well those genes perform in the real world.
So it's like nature is constantly running these experiments, trying out different combinations of genes and seeing which ones lead to better outcomes.
Right.
Those successful outcomes become the new priors for future
You've
generations.
got it. It's like nature is running a giant Bayesian optimization algorithm,
Wow.
always refining its predictions based on feedback from the environment. Chivers points out that even though evolution is a slow, messy process, it's incredibly effective at finding solutions that work.
Hmm.
And it all hinges on this principle of prediction and adaptation.
That's such an elegant way to think about evolution. It makes it seem less random and more like a purposeful, if somewhat blind, search for the best solutions.
It does challenge the traditional view of nature as purely random, and it suggests that this drive to minimize prediction error might be woven into the very essence of life itself.
Which brings us back to consciousness. We touched on this in the last part. If our brains are fundamentally prediction machines, does that mean our sense of self, our subjective experience, is just an illusion?
Another great question, and one that philosophers have been wrestling with for ages. But this Bayesian framework offers a fresh perspective. Chivers introduces the work of Carl Friston, who has put forward a fascinating theory called the free energy principle.
Free energy, like the kind we use to power our homes. How does that relate to consciousness?
Not the same kind of energy, no. But the concept is similar. Friston argues that living systems, including brains, are constantly trying to maintain order and stability, especially when faced with a constantly changing environment. And to do this, they minimize a quantity called free energy. In simple terms, you can think of this free energy as representing the difference between our internal model of the world and the actual sensory information we're taking in.
So it's like our brain is always trying to align its predictions with reality to make those two things match up. And when there's a mismatch, a gap between the prediction and reality, that's when it experiences this free energy as a type of discomfort or surprise.
You're getting it. And Friston suggests that everything we do, from basic reflexes to complex behaviors, can be seen as an attempt to minimize this free energy.
Wow.
We seek out information, we learn, we interact with the world. It's all about refining that model and reducing those prediction errors.
Wow, that's a powerful idea. It suggests that our sense of self, our subjective experience of being in the world, might emerge from this primal drive to minimize free energy.
It's a mind-blowing concept, isn't it? And it
Mhm.
has significant implications for understanding everything from perception to decision-making to even the nature of consciousness itself.
It makes you wonder if our experience of free will, that feeling of agency and control, is just a byproduct of our brain's attempts to minimize prediction error. What does that mean for us?
It's a possibility that many neuroscientists are exploring. The idea is that our brain generates a sense of agency when its predictions about the consequences of our actions line up with the actual sensory feedback we get.
Mm.
We feel in control because our actions make sense within our model of the world.
So you're saying our brain is constantly running these simulations, predicting the outcomes of different actions, and then picking the ones that are most likely to minimize that surprise or discomfort.
Hmm.
It's choosing the path of least resistance in a way.
That's one way to look at it. And much of this process likely happens unconsciously, with our conscious awareness coming into play after the fact.
Right.
It's like our conscious mind is providing a story, a narrative, to explain actions that have already happened.
That's a pretty radical idea. It suggests that our conscious experience of making a decision might be more of a story we tell ourselves than a real-time reflection of what's happening in our brains.
It does challenge that traditional view of free will as a conscious, deliberate choice. But it also brings up some fascinating questions about the role of awareness and intentionality.
Hmm.
We can still set intentions and goals. We can still make choices.
Hmm.
But understanding the role of these unconscious predictions gives us a deeper understanding of the forces at play.
So even if our initial impulses, our gut reactions, are driven by these unconscious predictions, we can still learn, adapt, and ultimately shape our own destinies through conscious effort.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of this Bayesian framework, its application to everyday decision-making. Chivers points out that understanding Bayes' theorem can make us more effective thinkers and decision-makers.
Okay, I'm all for making better decisions. How can this abstract mathematical concept, this idea of updating beliefs based on new evidence, help us navigate the complexities of real life?
Well, for one thing, it reminds us to be aware of our prior beliefs,
Right.
those assumptions we carry with us, and to be open to updating them as we encounter new evidence. We all have a tendency to get stuck in our ways, clinging to old assumptions, even when the facts have changed.
Right.
Bayes' theorem encourages us to be more flexible, to be willing to shift our thinking.
It's like a reminder to always be questioning those assumptions and to be open to changing our minds when presented with new information.
Exactly.
That's not always easy, but it's definitely valuable advice.
It is. And it also highlights the importance of considering base rates, the underlying probability of events. This is especially important when making judgments.
Right.
We often overestimate the likelihood of rare events, especially if they are vivid or emotionally charged.
Hmm.
Bayes' theorem helps us ground our thinking in a more realistic assessment of those probabilities.
That makes me think of all the times I've stressed about things that were statistically unlikely to happen. Maybe my brain was overestimating the probability because it was fixated on a particularly scary or negative scenario.
It's a very common cognitive bias.
Yeah.
And understanding Bayes' theorem can help us overcome it. Chivers also explores how this framework can be applied to more specific decision-making challenges, like evaluating the reliability of medical tests or making predictions about future events.
So it's not just some philosophical concept, it has very real, practical applications. I'm starting to see how this Bayesian perspective can shed light on so many different areas of life.
Absolutely. And Chivers even delves into how this Bayesian approach can be applied to games, specifically Wordle. He explains how you can use Bayes' theorem to strategically choose your guesses, maximizing your chances of winning.
Wait, you're telling me there's a mathematical strategy to winning Wordle? I always thought it was just luck and vocabulary.
There's definitely an element of luck, but understanding how to update your beliefs based on the feedback you receive can drastically improve your odds.
That's amazing. Even in a simple word game, we find these underlying patterns of prediction and adaptation. It makes you realize how much of our lives, our decisions, our experiences are shaped by these forces.
It's a fascinating insight, isn't it? And as we explore this Bayesian framework further, we'll see how it can illuminate not only how our brains work, but also how we interact with the world around us. But let's save that exploration for part 3 of this deep dive.
This is getting deep. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how this all comes together. Let's move on to part 3 and continue our journey into the world of prediction.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the world of prediction.
I'm glad you're still with us.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of Bayes' theorem to its mind-blowing implications for things like consciousness and free will. I'm eager to see how all of this connects to our everyday lives. In the last part, we talked about how understanding Bayes' theorem can help us become better thinkers and decision makers. Now I'm curious to explore how this framework can be applied to the way we experience the world around us.
One of the most fascinating applications of this Bayesian framework is in the realm of human perception. We often take for granted that our senses give us a direct, objective view of reality.
Right.
But the prediction error minimization model suggests something quite different.
Okay.
It proposes that our brains are actually constructing a model of the world based on our prior experiences and expectations.
So it's like our brains are creating a virtual reality, a simulation,
Right.
and our senses are simply providing feedback to refine that simulation.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And this model is constantly being updated as our brain compares its predictions with the actual sensory data it's receiving. Those discrepancies, those prediction errors, are what drive learning and adaptation.
That makes me think about optical illusions. Those images that trick our brains into seeing things that aren't really there. Are those illusions essentially examples of our prediction model going haywire? Glitches in the matrix, so to speak?
You could say that. Optical illusions exploit the shortcuts and assumptions our brains make when constructing that model of the world. They reveal the hidden mechanisms behind our perception, showing us how our brains try to make sense of ambiguous sensory information.
It's like those illusions are giving us a glimpse behind the curtain,
Right.
allowing us to see the machinery of perception in action. It's both fascinating and a little unnerving to realize how much of what we perceive as reality is actually constructed by our own minds.
It does raise some profound questions about the nature of reality, doesn't it? But this Bayesian framework offers a compelling explanation for how our brains manage to create a stable, coherent sense of self and world, despite the constant bombardment of sensory data.
It's both comforting and unsettling to realize that our perception of reality is so heavily influenced by our prior beliefs and expectations. It's like we're all living in slightly different versions of the same world.
That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah.
But it's also empowering to realize that we can actively shape our model of the world. We can challenge our assumptions, seek out new perspectives, and cultivate a more flexible, adaptable mindset.
So even though our brains are wired to predict and make sense of the world based on our past experiences, we're not trapped by those patterns.
Right.
We can learn and grow. We can rewrite the code of our own virtual reality, so to speak.
Precisely. And that brings us to another intriguing implication of this Bayesian framework.
Okay.
Its potential to help us understand and even treat mental health conditions like depression and anxiety.
You mentioned this earlier. Are you suggesting that mental health can be viewed through the lens of prediction errors?
It's a relatively new area of research, but some scientists believe that conditions like depression might be linked to overly strong, inflexible prior beliefs. It's like getting stuck in a negative thought pattern,
Right.
a negative loop,
Yeah.
and being unable to break free even when presented with evidence that contradicts that pattern.
So if someone has a strong prior belief that they're a failure, for example, they might interpret everything that happens through that lens, even their successes.
Right.
Their brain is predicting negative outcomes, filtering out any information that doesn't fit that narrative.
That's a good way to summarize it. And this perspective suggests that therapy, whether traditional talk therapy or other approaches, might work by helping people loosen the grip of those negative priors, to challenge those fixed beliefs and to become more open to new experiences that could potentially shift their perspective.
It makes sense. If you're constantly predicting that things will go wrong, you might miss out on opportunities and positive experiences that could challenge those beliefs. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Exactly. And this framework also offers intriguing insights into the potential of psychedelic drugs,
Okay.
like psilocybin, for treating certain mental health conditions.
We touched on this briefly in the first part. You said that psychedelic drugs might be able to shake up our belief systems. Can you elaborate on how these substances fit into this Bayesian picture?
Some researchers believe that psychedelics might work by temporarily weakening those rigid prior beliefs,
Okay.
creating a more flexible, expansive state of consciousness. This could allow individuals to step outside their usual thought patterns
Hmm.
and potentially gain new insights into themselves and the world.
It's like they're hitting the reset button on those deeply ingrained beliefs,
Right.
allowing for a fresh perspective.
That's one way to look at it. It's an exciting area of research with a lot of potential for new treatments.
This Bayesian framework is so incredibly insightful. It seems to provide a unifying explanation for so much, from the workings of our brains to the way we make decisions, to even the nature of reality itself.
Quite a framework.
But it also raises some big questions.
It does. It challenges some of our most fundamental assumptions about ourselves and the world.
If everything is predictable, even our own thoughts and actions, does that take away our sense of free will and responsibility?
That's a question that has plagued philosophers for centuries, and there's no easy answer. This framework doesn't necessarily negate free will. It simply suggests that our choices are influenced by a complex interplay of factors,
Mm.
many of which operate beneath the level of conscious awareness.
It's like our conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a vast, intricate network of unconscious processes shaping our thoughts and actions beneath the surface.
That's a great way to visualize it. And while we might not have complete control over all those unconscious processes,
Right.
we can still influence them through learning, reflection, and conscious effort. We can cultivate habits, develop skills, and create environments that support our values and goals.
So it's not about denying the influence of our biology or our past experiences.
No.
It's about understanding those influences and recognizing the power we have to shape our own destinies within those constraints.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of understanding Bayes' theorem and its implications.
Yeah.
By recognizing how our brains work, how they make predictions and update beliefs, we gain valuable insights into ourselves and the world around us.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've gone from the basic principles of Bayes' theorem to the very nature of consciousness and reality. I feel like I have a completely new understanding of how my brain works and how I interact with the world.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise.
And remember, even though we've reached the end of this deep dive,
Right.
the journey of learning and discovery never truly ends. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep updating your beliefs as you encounter new information and experiences.
Wise words. And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about the fascinating world of prediction, I highly recommend checking out Everything is Predictable by Tom Chivers. We've only scratched the surface here, and there's a wealth of insights waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, keep those predictions sharp, keep those minds open, and keep exploring the world with curiosity and wonder.